Welcome to episode 4 of the podcast, WTF Now by S7. In this episode, we explore what's next for the nation of Norway. As one of the world's leading producers of oil and gas, Norway is a tremendous success story. A nation that has managed its natural resource wealth better than almost any other. It's also developed key technologies that make the subsea oil and gas industry what it is today. But could Norway become a national example of Nokia when the iPhone emerged? Will it be able to move from strength to strength without experiencing uncomfortable disruption in the way? The energy game is also changing. Nations around the world are increasing their investments in renewables, but Norway is not. Why is that? And will that change before it's too late? To explore this topic, we're joined by Stephen Bull, CEO of Vårgrønn, a Norwegian offshore wind company. Stephen earned his Order of the British Empire for his contributions to the UK's green transition and to UK-Norway relations. But he hasn't always been a renewable energy champion. He cut his teeth in the oil and gas industry. So you could say he has unique insights from both sides of the table, from a corporate perspective and also as the former chair of Renewable UK. Stephen isn't afraid to challenge conventional or pie-in-the-sky thinking. He likes to see the data before making a claim. All of these things make him perfect for this topic and this episode. Enjoy. Welcome. This is the first time we've ever tried to do a live episode. And if you followed the podcast at all, it's not that many episodes that we've done at all. So it's all a bit of an experiment. One of the things that our company does is work with leadership teams and companies that are needing to transform for some reason. We often do that by bringing in external voices, an expert in something to sort of mix things up and bring some oxygen into the room. And we thought it might be interesting to do that in a space where other folks than just the client could participate. So this is the first time we've ever tried to do it live. Hello to everybody that's online. Thanks so much for joining. And also thanks so much to the Conduit also for the opportunity to have it here. The topic we wanted to explore today is sort of around what is Norway doing with its energy identity. Stephen inspired that with a LinkedIn post 4, 5, 6 weeks ago that was inspired by an FT article where China was sort of build a Electrostate, right? Stephen and I have known each other for about 10 years or so. Stephen has worked on all of the sides of the aisle, as it were, in the energy space, spent a long time in the oil and gas business, which is where we got to know each other when I was facilitating a process with Equinor, then Statoil, on what should we do with regard to climate change and renewables. And Stephen is now the CEO of Vårgrønn, which is a Norwegian-based, at least, offshore wind company that's very active off the shore of the UK and in other places. The last thing I want to say introduction-wise is neither of us are Norwegians. I'm from the US, Stephen's from the UK. We're both citizens now, both been here for a little over 20 years, right? So super vested in the future of Norway, also with some other perspectives. Anybody who's followed what's going on in my country knows that other perspectives has a wide definition at this point. We thought we would start off with a little exploration of Norway's split identity. Stephen was very keen to make sure that we put some facts in all of this as well, too. Everything's referenced if anybody's curious about a claim. The sort of setup here is that Norway, interestingly, is one country that electrified earlier and faster than most, right? 47% of total energy consumption today in the Norwegian energy mix is electricity. Last month, 98.7% of the energy in the country was renewable. 90.8% was hydro. Interestingly, most of the rest of it was onshore wind, right? 60 heat pumps installed per 100 households, which is the highest ratio in the world. And there are now more EVs on Norwegian roads than gasoline cars. There are slightly more diesel cars on the road still than EVs. And 89% of new cars sold in 2024 were full battery electric vehicles. So Stephen, how did Norway pull this off?
Thanks, Rick. We have to go back a little bit in time in history here. So Norway's early industrialization came essentially through hydroelectricity. So that was grain mills. It was local electricity, and Hammerfest is actually known as the first town with actually the whole town electrified with hydroelectricity. So that was the early phase. And then what happened a bit later was that there was a technology development in Norway. And that was through industrialist Sam Ida and then Christian Birkeland, who's a physicist. So anyone who worked in Norsk Hydro, as I did, knows this story inside out, by the way. But I have to tell it there because it's really important, because the growth of Norsk Hydro as a company in 1905 is basically Norway's industrial story. So what it was is that they developed a technology which is actually to produce fertilizer through an electric arc. So they're basically trying to take nitrogen out of the air. And it was incredibly energy intensive operation. So they needed to actually find constant power, and they did that through hydroelectricity. The best places they found there was in Telemark, which is one of the counties in Norway, where blessed with pretty decent water, lakes. It has all the rivers, everything you need there. And they started to dam up and actually buy rights to waterfalls. And they've developed these. It was more like a Klondike feel. It was sort of completely sort of the gold rush kind of age at the time. And there were three in particular. There's Vemork, Svelgfoss, and Tinnfoss, which are three really important hydroelectricity producing areas. And Vemork itself, actually, it was the largest hydroelectric plant in 1911 in the world, and it's actually on the UN list as well for World Heritage Sites. But this important for the here is that they developed this. They put the power there to try and produce the fertilizer. And what was fascinating here is within 10 years, that whole process was completely disrupted by a German. So it was the Haber-Bosch technique, which actually they started to use gas and coal and others instead, ironically, much more polluting than this process, and it was much less energy intensive. So completely disrupted all those investments that went into hydroelectric power. So what do you do with all the extra capacity? Well, you could do a lot of things with it, but the actual push here was to electrify the country and start connecting the country across. So taking the inspiration for Hammerfest and started to take towns and cities through electrification. But the other thing was actually to start producing aluminium. Now, the raw material in aluminium is called bauxite, and there is hardly any of it in Norway. Basically, it comes from Australia, Brazil, Africa. But what you do have in Norway is obviously you had constant and clean and power. You also have deep water fjords. You have a world-leading shipping industry as well. So the bauxite came in. You can produce the alumina with that, and then from alumina you make aluminium by smelting it. And that's why you can find, some sites in Norway, three major ones as well. But you find still today you'll find large production of aluminium here, based on essentially that power. So fast forward a little bit now, we've got about 1,700 electric power plants of various sizes in Norway, mostly from reservoirs and some from the run-of-river as well. And it's actually a big part of Norway's energy identity. And energy identity is quite important. If you think of the French, what do you think of? Nuclear. The Brits need to think of coal and the industrialization, but Norway has essentially hydroelectricity. It is a really important part of that energy identity. Let's fast forward a bit more from there. So there was quite a strong build-up of hydroelectricity, industrialization of Norway through the 50s and through the 60s. And at the same time, you had a lot of environmental movement. And that was major protests against new developments of hydroelectricity. So the Alta case was a huge one. There was hunger strikes, civil disobedience. It's a real classic 60s pushback against the state and against industry. And then even just a few years ago, in 2023, we had the major case at the Fosen onshore wind farm, which was a large civil disobedience case. There was a Supreme Court ruling that came up there. So the pushback against hydroelectricity it's quite intense, as has been towards onshore wind and other parts of energy. And there's a number here that I got out here from Fornybar Norge, which is a Renewable Norway trade association. And the statistic here is that since 2021, just 0.5 terawatt hour of new power has been added in Norway, in a country that consumes 139 terawatt hours. So what's interesting probably for many Europeans who don't know this is that there is an immense push back against new power in Norway. Ironically, because the world is going electric.
How many hydroelectric installations did you say? 1,700. So I think that's an important piece of information when it comes to electricity, power, energy, et cetera. You can't get it without lots of producing assets of some kind, right? You can't get it without impact. And so that was true then with hydro. It's been true recently as well, but about 2/3 of the way through the 20th century, Norway discovered another national treasure, right? Another resource. So take us through that process.
People say that Norway won the lottery Christmas Eve on 1969. So there's a lot of myths around these kind of things. I'll try and unpack those a bit. So that was the discovery of the Ekofisk field, still in production today. So that was a major development for Norway in terms of its oil and gas industry. But you have to put this in perspective. You don't just suddenly stumble across deep water hydrocarbons. You have to have a technology development, and that came from the US. So in the US, most oil and gas production was onshore. and you start to drill off the shelf, as they call it, shallower water off the coast of Louisiana and Texas, and you start to go deeper into deep water and ultra deep water eventually. So all that technology was developing over time. Deep water drilling technology that was also being used and applied where they could try and find oil in the North Sea basin itself. And what actually the country that first found oil and gas was the Netherlands. So in 1959, Shell and Exxon found gas in the Netherlands. It's called the Groningen field. It's got quite a history to it itself there, and that started producing in 1963. It's a massive gas field, and it transformed the Dutch economy, not to the best. We can come on about to the Dutch disease and how that was an issue in the future. But what happened there is obviously the Brits and the Norwegians have looked at the Dutch and they said, okay, well, we must start dishing out exploration licenses. And they started doing that fast in 1965 onwards. And then you found that through grit and hard work and sometimes a little bit of luck, you found oil. So the Ekofisk field, a huge field, and also the Montrose field in the UK that was found roughly about the same time. So these are really important points, and that meant that to the North Sea itself, as you start to find more oil, it became what we call a prolific basin. This is a major basin producing in the world, and really had an incredible wealth that we've had for both, the countries I come from, Norway and the UK. When it comes to the state's role in this, there's a huge difference between the UK, which was more of the neoliberal, sort of really market force approach. It was actually more about deregulation, whereas Norway took a very different path. To more of a state-controlled development. But like the 20th century, and especially with, for example, hydroelectricity, there was a law up to 1917 to say that, okay, we can't have any foreign control over our waterfalls. So they actually put a law in place with only Norwegian and mostly state companies or state-oriented state capitalism was to be essentially dominating here. And they did the same model within Norway as well, with the setup of 1972 from Statoil. What's also thinking about this is that there's quite a lot of luck involved. There were two major oil crises in the 1970s. 1973, Yom Kippur War, Israel. OPEC essentially stopped exporting to all Western countries. Huge crisis. So oil prices went from $3 to about $13 a barrel overnight. 1979, 1980, in that area, they had the Iranian Revolution as well. They went from about to $15 to jump to $30 a barrel. So huge increase in oil prices, immense profitability. Luckily for the oil and gas companies that invested in that, and obviously for the Norwegian state as well. I think the one thing is it created, in some sense, a cultural aspect, because whilst Norway has been a rich country for some time, it essentially it's created something where Norwegians are extremely proud of the oil and gas industry. So the Swedes have got their cars, and Norway's got its oil, and it's something that still lives there today.
The Swedes had their cars. Sorry. Right. So can you put a couple of numbers on that just to put the size of the importance of the oil and gas industry into context for Norway?
So I read my notes because I need to. So it's from SSB, Statistics Norway. So last year, 60% of export revenues came from oil and gas. That's 1,113 billion Norwegian kroner. Not a small sum. 24% of tax income came from oil and gas. That's 698 billion Norwegian kroner into the coffers. And that's a bit consistent. Okay, prices go up and down, but it's usually about a fifth that comes in from tax revenues. And then what's probably more important to understand is that, okay, the money's coming in, the revenues are there, 200,000 people are employed wider in the oil and gas industry. But it's the Norwegian state's exposure to hydrocarbons is much bigger than just that. So we unpack that a little bit for everybody. So first and foremost, you've got something called the SDFI, the State's Direct Financial Interest. And that is basically a company called Petoro, which is 100% owned by the Norwegian state, and that owns about 1 million barrels a day across different licenses across the North Sea. And then you've got ownership in Equinor. So the state owns 67% of Equinor. So that's about 1.5 million barrels a day exposure. And then you've got dividends from Equinor. Offshore taxation at 78%, CO2, value-added tax, plus income from the oil fund. And the oil fund actually invests in 211 different energy companies across the whole world. Not all are oil and gas, but quite a few are oil and gas. So that's a pretty big exposure. And here, hence we come back to the moniker Petrostate or Electrostate. But Petrostate itself is actually a bit of a derogatory term. It's not particularly positive. You think of Russia, Iraq, you think of Venezuela, high concentration of economic and political power. So Norway isn't that in any respect. But what's interesting is that again, Norway is a balanced economy, but oil has a huge space in the Norwegian psyche. So one thing, you've got the oil fund, which you can keep tapping into to try and keep things running, and also maybe avoid difficult political decisions. but also you have a very extreme wide exposure to it, from as a country. So just sort of there's something here, thinking about how to explain this on a Friday afternoon when it's 24 degrees outside. But anyway, bear with me. So I studied politics and economics, and there's a political thinker called Antonio Gramsci. He is an Italian Marxist. He was obviously stuck in prison under Mussolini, but he wrote something called the Prison Notebooks. And for anyone who studied politics, psychology, then and sociology, he came up with a concept called hegemony. The hegemony itself isn't just about political and economic power. It's ideological and it's social. So like an economic force, but it becomes that something called the dominant ideology, that everything that we understand today actually is right. So it's about actually understanding and questioning where we get those kind of myths or psyche around certain things. And it's an interesting way to try and describe a little bit of how Norway thinks about oil.
The Petrostate thing is interesting, and you're right, it is a little bit derogatory, right? But it's also a good idea sometimes to set the fisken på bordet, right? To put the fish on the table. And so I went and I looked at my own home country, right? So the US over the past 10, 15 years, because of the shale gas revolution, has become the largest producer in the world, right? So if you look at that percentage of GDP wise, you come up with the extraction industry contributing about 1% of GDP in the US in 2023, right? And if you extrapolate that to include the supplier industry, you come up with somewhere between 5 and 7%. And I think the number that you're talking about for Norway is close to 20. So that's interesting when you put it into that perspective, and then you ask the question, okay, what does that mean, right? So on the hegemony point, just to unpack that a little bit more, practical example of it?
I mean, I'm not sure how this came or whether kids learn it at school, but there's a popular misconception that Norway was really, really poor in the 1970s. Now, I grew up in the 70s, so we all felt poorer than we did today. But when you look at it and you look at World Bank numbers, Norway's GDP per capita, so size of the economy divided by the number of people in it, was about the third highest in Europe. So take out, Liechtenstein and those guys in Monaco, but it was behind essentially Denmark and Sweden. So that was the 1970s, what was seen as the classic social democratic Scandinavian model, which many tried to exemplify in many respects. So Norway was basically a rich country. It's 30% richer than the UK in 1970, and it was richer than West Germany, the Netherlands, and Italy. So it wasn't true that, oil saved us. But what is true is that Norway's riches were boosted massively. So if you think of the period in 1999, you had a complete massive oil crash. It was, I remember it myself, I worked in oil trading, and prices were under $10 a barrel. And it was like, how's this going to happen? The economy, again, was not saying struggling massively. It's a balanced economy, but I think most politicians felt it at the time. But between 1999 and 2008, you saw that prices went from $10 a barrel to about $150 a barrel. Huge increase. Norway's GDP per capita nearly trebled in that time. So it's not just because of oil. There was a lot of reform going on, and there was markets opening up a lot more than the state. But this had a major contribution to it. I think that's also something about that ingrains in the hegemony again, is that our richness here is only based on oil. And I think that's something where it's obviously so it's harder to criticize in terms of the oil industry. And I'm not a critique of the oil industry at all. It's incredibly successful in Norway, but it does ingrain the debate in many respects. And maybe in some respects, it actually pulls back or inhibits other industries.
We also often hear is that we should let the market handle it, the free market. But this transformation didn't necessarily happen by itself, right? Not according to the free market. So unpack that a little bit.
So again, let's compare up against the UK and Norway. In 1971, savvy civil servants and politicians, and this is Lykkeland story, 101, but they basically came out with the 10 commandments of oil, the 10 oljebud. And this is clearly about state control, management of resources, coexistence with the fishing industry, and also developing a national champion in Statoil. There are many other parts of the 10, of the number the 10. This is distinct difference from the UK. UK was all about drill, baby, drill, a little bit. And it was about deregulation, particularly state-owned BP started to be privatized, and it was just all out there. So the actual production rates in Norway, went much higher than the UK. And you can see that the reservoirs are exploited much faster than they are in Norway. So it's better resource management. But also, let's face it, the setup of the oil fund in 1990 was an incredibly important part of this sort of policy-making, state control. And we can see today, obviously, the success of the oil fund. But the important thing is that you avoided this resource curse. So every petrostate, put it that way, has always been economically a bit of a disaster. Mass inflation, wage inflation, crowding out other industries, and obviously currency appreciation that happens there. So all of that money, and not everybody understands that outside of Norway, all of that money invested in the oil fund actually is basically in equities, property and fixed income outside of Norway. But Norway does, obviously, politicians tap into that money, and that's become a larger part of actually running the state. But I think the important part about this is that the exposure the Norwegian state has towards oil and gas is pretty considerable. And if we try and explain a little bit of how this works. So you have a 78% tax rate. So it's, again, it's high risk, high reward. That's oil and gas in a nutshell. But what you do have is that the state essentially, through its tax system, it underpins, or it's like a bank guarantor for exploration. So it's carrying us as taxpayers, carrying the risk for the exploration. And then when and if the oil comes, high rewards there. But it means that there's a major exposure towards that as well. The other part, I think, is the importance of oil and gas was clearly quite shown in 2020. So again, back to when we saw the COVID crisis, we saw that oil prices roughly were $70 a barrel on average before COVID hit, and it took about 6 months to drop to 20. Again, we went through a massive economic net downturn, and obviously nobody was traveling. That spooked politicians massively in Norway, and they very fast passed an act that gave the oil industry 85 billion Norwegian kroner in tax rebates to try and get things back up. It's called the activity package or tax package, however you want to describe it. But it was very successful because you did one thing. You got actually some of the yards, particularly in Norway, working on new projects again. And there's a wave of these things. But that tax package is now falling off again. And there's even discussion about should there be another tax package for that to try and help oil and gas because activity levels are dropping. So it just shows that when Norway wants to do something about a crisis, it can do and will do. And then just maybe just the last thing about pick out again the oil fund again. Let me just read out what they say in terms of actually how they manage hydrocarbon risk or they feel about climate risk. So climate risk has long-term and systematic characteristics with outcomes and trajectories associated with great uncertainty. If you put that in front of the Norwegian state, then we see that maybe Norway is too exposed to hydrocarbons. It's too high. And if you think of, if you did reduce some of that there, could you direct policy? Could you direct a different support system towards where Norway could have a competitive advantage? And I'm thinking advanced manufacturing, marine technology, higher education, research, and renewable energy.
Interestingly, Norway has a legacy of making far-sighted, often resource-based investments in indirect value creation models that maybe weren't intended, but ended up lasting for generations, right? You've mentioned Israel and Iran. Right. And since we were preparing yesterday evening, Israel and Iran are, of course, back in the news again. Right. So if you start to make a list of the things that complicate the stability of the oil price and complicate earnings for somebody who's very reliant on it, that list is very long. It includes the climate points that you mentioned from Norges Bank or the oil fund. It includes what's happening in the U.S. It includes the geopolitical issues that we're seeing in the Middle East still. It includes something that we're going to talk about last, of course, also. But the interesting question for Norway is, can one shake off the seeming security blanket that oil and gas is in order to develop a next one? Another interesting question, does it have to be resource-based? Could it be something else? You mentioned advanced manufacturing. The rather loud and I think super constructive conversation that's happening in the Norwegian startup space is an interesting example of that. Can we incentivize those sorts of businesses as much as we incentivize the oil and gas business?
A quick break from the serious stuff. If you're enjoying the podcast, please give us a like, leave a review, or hit follow. It helps more people find What the Fuck Now, and it keeps our algorithm overlords happy.
We have a situation now where Norway is exporting electrons, but not high-tech value chain or clean tech value chains. We often hear in the news that many of the decisions that are being made about these new things are being made based on value creation opportunity now or in the short term. The oil and gas comfort blanket is heavy and comfortable. The Norwegian Oil Fund holds $1.8 trillion US dollars. And 460 of it was derived from oil and gas revenue directly, the rest of it from the investments that Stephen mentioned earlier. Several energy companies are saying that government delays in licensing and approvals are slowing the development of clean energy projects, right? But at the same time, 57% of Norwegians support offshore wind, 33% oppose. In the UK, public support is up around 76%. So it's an interesting difference, right? Recent commentary also suggests that Norway's oil shame has sort of gone, right? And the country no longer pretends to be as ambitious on climate commitments. That's been in the news just the last couple of weeks, right? And Jens Stoltenberg recently stated that offshore wind may not be viable in the short term, and that Norway should prioritize affordable electricity and hydro, right? Reflecting a more cautious, potentially oil and gas first tone. So a question that I have after that is, if Norway had applied the same must profit now in the short term to things like hydro or fossil fuels when those things happened, would they have become the national projects that they have and the legacies that they've become since? What are some of the costs of sticking to the path that Norway's on at the moment?
I think the whole bit about it, I think, is that we work and run a company with offshore wind. So we meet a lot of politicians in different countries, in many places. And I think the harder bit here is that you've seen that there's a greater polarization of the discussion here. It's the same in the UK, but some areas not. But Norway was always seen as a pretty consistent place, and we hope that was right for energy transition. You do have the main central parties that do agree on at least the direction of climate, CO2 reductions, electrification of the economy. We do see a polarization. And it's quite easy for politicians to pick up on that polarization. And it's so easy to say no. It's much easier to say no than yes to do stuff. Yes is hard. No is easy. And that's sort of frustrating, I think, for many who work in industry to do this, because there's a few fact points here that we have to think about in this country. First and foremost, all international oil and gas investments are dropping. That came from the IEA 2 weeks ago, their new investment summit report. And then Offshore Norway, which is a trade association, says that about 29% reduction in oil and gas investments until 2029. I would probably say it's probably higher than that. And if you ask any of the major supply chain companies in Norway, how's your order book for the next 3 years? You're going to get a pretty grim look on your face. So this is a chance, again, this is the hard bit about how do you pivot here? And it's not all gloom and doom.
And that order book argument was a big part of the argument for the oil package during COVID, and has been used again as a big part, right? So, and that wouldn't be a market-based mechanism. So we'll consider doing that for the oil and gas industry potentially. But when we think about some of these new businesses, we're more careful to do that. Sorry.
You're right. You have to. I mean, these industries, as well as oil industries, do need support. Carbon capture and storage is a big story in itself in Norway. It's I would say it was a technology success story. It's taken time. It's taken money. It's taken 40+ billion kroner over the last 20 years. But the European Union has made legislation that is actually, they've calculated the emissions from European oil and gas companies and turned it upside and said, okay, you have to store this much of CO2 by 2030, 2035. You're creating a market for it, which wasn't there before. So you need to believe in something. And I think that's a little bit where you are in terms of offshore wind, where Norway has incredible competence, long coastline. We have fantastic oil and gas companies. We have technology companies. And Norway earned, or Norwegian supply chain earned 40 billion NOK, Norwegian kroner, in exports from the offshore wind sector. Half of every vessel from Norwegian companies goes towards the offshore wind sector globally as well. So, I mean, Boston Consulting Group ranked Norway 4th in terms of ability for energy transition, annoyingly behind Sweden, Denmark, Germany, just slightly pipped the UK. I mean, Norway should be number 1. And that's the thing, it's just not punching above its weight. And it could be doing that if we could avoid the political flip-flopping and have a bit more of a consensus around the direction, a bit what they had in the 70s.
What's an example of a country that is in a way an analog to Norway that's doing something like what you're suggesting?
So let's pick on a country, let's pick on Ireland for that one. So we'll also pick on it because we're working on a project potentially with Ireland. There's auctions coming up for offshore wind. So there's a country that we, as a company involved in, have been back and forth a lot, speaking to policymakers, politicians, people there. So it's kind of interesting because the analog is interesting because it's very windy. It's a green country. It's very friendly. There's high taxation. Personal taxation is quite expensive. It's no wonder the Vikings wanted to move there because it's a bit like Norway in some respects. Obviously, it's not particularly mountainous. But Ireland has taken a very different economic path, and it's not one for Norway to do that. I mean, exploiting a taxation arbitrage between the EU and the US. It's invested very heavily in terms of pharmaceuticals, in terms of high tech, the rest of it, infrastructure. It's very savvy at using EU funds. Norway's not in that position to do that, and that's not really probably the right economic path. What was interesting is that Ireland's richer than Norway now. So Ireland's GDP per capita is higher than Norway, and it's taken a huge increase. And okay, you could say that is at risk in terms of Trump tariffs and the rest of it. But what is interesting is that Irish politicians are extremely savvy. They used to talk to multinational companies, the Microsofts, the Facebooks, the Salesforces of the world, and negotiating with them. And also, you can tell that when you start speaking to them. And when they see offshore wind, they see this. They don't talk about the price of offshore wind. We're actually talking, what's the prosperity to our country? What can offshore wind give us in terms of economic growth, R&D, upgrading ports, regional policy as well, outside of Dublin, all of the stuff that we should talk about here in Norway. So it's not the price of the electrons themselves, it's the total value add you get out of it. And that's something which, is a bit of a debate I think we're missing a bit here. You get that in the UK, but we're struggling to get that debate here.
And interestingly, it could be that Ireland read the history books of Norway and said, my gosh, we're not installing offshore wind capacity. We're not building the electrical power generation capacity of our country in order to sell electrons. We're building it for something else, the indirect thing. The fertilizer production, et cetera, that you talked about at the very beginning. So that's an important mindset shift, and maybe not completely dissimilar to the way that Sam Ida was and others were thinking way back when.
Okay, time for a quick plug. What the Fuck Now is powered by S7. We're an Oslo-based advisory firm that helps senior leaders, usually at the C-suite or extended leadership level, make sense of big shifts in geopolitics, climate, and society. Then we help them do something about it. For years, we've been sitting with clients, usually behind closed doors, trying to help them cut through the noise, challenge their assumptions, and see the world more clearly. This podcast is our attempt to open up that conversation to you too. If that sounds like your kind of thing, follow us on LinkedIn.
Back to the LinkedIn post, the sort of impetus for the discussion, right? So we've talked about this so far, at least, really without talking about the elephant in the room. And I hope China doesn't mind being referred to as an elephant. The Electrostate article in the Financial Times, they've been making tracks, basically, in many different ways. Tell us a bit about that, Stephen.
You can't talk about the energy industry without the elephant in the room, without China. And it's essential, especially renewables. So again, looking at the notes, here's the facts. Again, so the 1/3 of global electricity in the world is consumed by China. It has 43% of all solar and wind capacity. 40% of all nuclear, 50% of new nuclear builds, 80% of the world's solar panels are produced in China. It's the world's largest oil importer. It is the largest customer of Saudi Arabia and Russia, and it constructed 95 gigawatts of new coal in 1 year. It's doing everything. I mean, it's just impossible to ignore. But what is interesting about it is that it's always had this very long-term view of the world. And particularly this vulnerability towards OPEC, oil imports, the Middle East. I mean, it's seen and understood what happened in 73 and 79, and to think how to avoid that. And if I sort of tell a story here about this, if you go back to 1987, so 87, actually, of all things, it was Black Monday, where stock markets crashed. The global population was 5 billion people. Now it's 8.2. And then probably the most important thing for you, you've got a namesake from 1987, Rick Astley. Never going to give you up, never going to let you down. Right. Yeah, if there's a connection. Deng Xiaoping, he was in Baotao, which is in Outer Mongolia. And he held a speech that said, the Middle East has oil, China has rare earths. Now that probably didn't resonate much there, especially with Rick Astley. But it does resonate now because 70% of all rare earth concentrates are in China or owned by Chinese companies. 87% of processing is under Chinese control and 91% of refining. So this clear view about the domination of a supply chain and the raw materials there is something clearly the Chinese have thought a lot about. And then it was really more since 2000. There was a new economic plan 2000. The Chinese joined the World Trade Organization. And if you look at essentially people coming out of poverty, CO2 emissions, demand, it all went like a rocket when you start to look at that. Let's look at those charts. And then clearly China had a focus here, is that there will be, to reduce the dependency on fossil fuels, it would start to push on green technologies. It probably didn't dream about where it would be today, but it had a clear vision of that it wanted to dominate certain sectors, solar, wind, etc. So Chinese GDP now, 10% of that comes from the clean energy sector. It's quite considerable, especially when you talked about the extractive numbers from the US. And then electrification rates, so essentially electrification of the total economy went from 19% to 28% in 14 years, while it was growing on everything else as well. So it's a phenomenal journey the country has made. And then it's also about domination in tech here. So the EV revolution is one thing, which scares the life out of major European car manufacturers, but there's the domination of things like batteries, storage, high-tech equipment around that. And that has political power as well as economic power.
You have the culmination of a lot of parallel long-term strategies, right? And interestingly, that same mindset again that you described from Ireland, and that potentially we talked about maybe having been present here in Norway way back when, right? Of that indirect approach. Now China's also seeing that that's a huge opportunity and aiming to own all of those value chains and being very successful. So if we think about the potential for Norway to make some moves that are not measured purely by short-term returns, and then also expand the picture and talk about Europe in the same regard, right? A couple of years ago, when the IRA was launched, we were thinking, wow, Europe is going to be left behind. This is going to be between the US and between China. Now there's a question mark, obviously, with the US, and we read time after time after time here in Norway, or in Europe generally, this project is canceled, this project is waiting, this project has too few bidders, a lot of battery companies, et cetera, right? Because they're just not going to be profitable immediately, which then means we're going to buy all that stuff from China. And is that smart over time? So interestingly too, China's been in a position to have those, Deng Xiaoping, to have that long-term vision, but also build huge experience in manufacturing, advanced manufacturing in the past 10 or 20 years. And software. So now they've sort of got all the pieces on the table in front of them. And we're sitting here having a discussion about whether or not we can profit enough in the short term to bother, and sitting back on our laurels. So there's another thing. You mentioned China being super motivated also because they're a net importer, right? So they would love to become less reliant on sources of energy outside of their borders. The other thing, and I would love to do a complete episode on this at some point, and I think we sort of did, but I'd like to do it over again and focus even more, is the efficiency revolution, right? The fact that if I had a match in my hand right now and I lit it and I held my other hand above it, what would happen? Well, I would burn the shit out of myself. And the reason for that is because combusting anything creates heat. Most of the time it creates more heat than anything else, right? So the most effective GE gas power plants at this point are in the high 50s. More than 40% of the gas is just wasted. So on average in the world, 64% of the fuel that is combusted to make energy is wasted, right? So if you think about a tax break moving into a future where people didn't have that, reality would certainly be an interesting one. We've gone a bit global and big picture, but let's come back to Norway now in the final chapter. So the window isn't closed, but it's definitely narrowing, and there's other players out there that are playing to win in very big ways. The tax package is coming to an end. Oil and gas investment is declining. I think in 2024, the amount of renewables investments around the world has doubled what the investment in new fossil fuel development is. Many of the folks that'll be listening are business leaders thinking about resilience, competitiveness, et cetera. We all care about Norway's resilience and economic future. So, Stephen, does Norway still have a window in a world where global competition is heating up? And what would you suggest that these policymakers consider doing?
This is my glass half full thing, okay? Because you've got to, otherwise nobody's going to follow you. Now, it's not all gloom and doom in Norway. Norway, as I mentioned before, I said, 50% of all vessels from Norwegian companies are going to offshore wind. It was 40 billion Norwegian kroner in exports. But again, these are vulnerable times as well, and especially for offshore wind. So we need to think about, solar technologies, energy storage, grid systems, and essentially the application of AI towards, the grid and also investments. So we're seeing Norway will have record investments in the power sector this year. So according to statistics, Norway, 57 billion Norwegian krone will be spent, but half on grid, half on new upgrades. But even if we had someone from Statkraft or one of the major power producers here, they say they're struggling with business cases because the struggle is that you have too low prices in Norway, not high enough to justify that. At the same time, we want the right level. It's it's too hot or too cold, because we want industry to come to Norway because we have low prices. But they won't just move to anywhere. They want to have skilled people. They want infrastructure. They want stability, particularly in terms of policy stability. And that is the key thing that the Boston Consultancy Group report came out there. They said not enough investment here because based on lack of stability in terms of policy. And that's fixable. I mean, it's Norway. You can fix it. Politics works here. So that's, it's not all empty there. You've got Able, Aker Solutions, Subsea 7, Havfram, Cadeler, great companies that are doing stuff, globally. And you've got like tech startups. There's a really interesting one called Spore, which does bird monitoring. You've got Vind AI, which essentially puts together wind project design. Norwegian-based companies punch above their weight. So you have those. But here you have also a chance, because when you do drive new industries, you eventually drive education. And there is a massive lack of electrical engineers in the world. You drive research and development. I mean, this is where you used to be getting the best university professors you can from countries that are not feeling so good at being at universities, and put them in technical universities in Norway. This is a chance to really exploit some of the positions that we have here and actually really fill the gap in terms of those bottlenecks, which is really highly in education. But one other thing, just maybe last story here. So the Hywind Tampen project, which had support from the Norwegian government from Enova, 2.4 billion Norwegian kroner, plus a bit more cash on top. It is a support there to develop floating offshore wind. It's the world's largest offshore wind farm, run by Equinor, and it reduces the CO2 emissions of some of the oil and gas fields there. What's important about that one is that 60% of that was Norwegian content. 60% of the value came out of Norway. And this was competitive. So it's not a favor. It was competitive bidding process. So Norwegian companies can do this when they try, but it has to be really with a guide and a support from authorities. And that's the hard bit about it, is when you ask those bigger companies who are running oil and gas projects today, activity levels are running down. The gap between running down that one and actually building up for new offshore wind projects is a little bit depressing, because there's a bit of a gap here. And the problem is, if you start to furlough those people, then often they don't come back. And you need a strong oil and gas sector to try and switch over into renewables. Otherwise, you deindustrialize and we have to build it all up again. So here, we can't miss out on that momentum. Let's not wait for a crisis for that to happen. That's kind of the message we'd like more for politicians. And then the whole thing about this is about Norway's comparative advantage as a country. It's not going to compete on cheap labor, but it can compete on higher AI, additive manufacturing, advanced manufacturing, and highly educated people as well. So the chances are all there.
Thanks, Stephen. So how did we do on our fact ratio, do you feel?
Hopefully okay. I'm sure I'm going to get fact-checked.
Did you observe me making up any new facts as we went?
See, there were some interesting facts. I don't think you sourced them.
We'll have to come back to that. Thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you so much.
And now we'd like to open up to questions.
I'm from Germany, just for a little bit of context. So we are very strong, of course, on automotive, and I see the comparison that it's really part of our identity. I feel like because it's so ingrained in our identity, we didn't make that shift to EVs soon enough, and now the crisis hits with BYD. The fuzzy open question for the room is, how do you get there to switch a democracy from that identity to move ahead of the crisis?
I'd use Denmark as an example. So Denmark decided, I think it was around 2020, it had a law, it had been discussed many years before that, to essentially give out no more oil and gas exploration licenses, and essentially try to position towards really as offshore wind, green technology. And as someone who's worked in oil and gas for many, many years, we can say, well, not surprising, because the Danish sector is quite terrible in terms of oil and gas production. It is peanuts compared to Norway, reserves, etc. But regardless of the resource issue between that, it made a conscious decision, but also it did it in very much a transparent economic debate and a public open debate around this. And then there was a compensation for oil and gas workers. There was a clear plan of how to actually, so essentially manage decline, or just transition as we call it today, and then a clear build-up and support from authorities to build the new industries. It was planned out over time. So I think that's an important part of it. I think the hard bit about it is, it's the cliche of the Kodak moment. how do you disrupt yourself when you're kind of slathered in money? It's quite hard to do that, isn't it? Do you have to wait for a crisis to do it, or can you actually consciously do that?
I'd like to give a little bit more dreamy answer, or a foofy one, which I think is that it also helps to have some leader out there who's willing to broadcast a dream, and a vision, rather than just, there was a CEO that we talked to many years ago who was lamenting the financialization of everything, right? How we're so hesitant to make investments, even when the money is potentially sitting right there. And in this country, it's definitely sitting right there, if we can't prove that we can make money off it in the short term. I mean, the auto industry issue in Germany is slightly different in that you had like piles and piles of assets with long depreciation timelines and culture and et cetera, right? But so that's like part of the problem, which was a little bit similar in a way to the oil and gas issue that we were working together on years ago, right? When you're very successful on something and that success has become your identity, which is maybe also true of Norway to a degree, it becomes a crisis of identity to admit that you'd be willing to try something else. So that's like part of it. But then I think the other part of it that we fall short on today often is having somebody out there who's willing to put a mark somewhere, and people give the Kennedy and the moon thing. And I think the Eisenhower and Normandy thing was probably another example, completely batshit crazy to even try it. But if he hadn't, what would the world look like today? So there's an element of that too, I think.
Okay, this is from Arita from Offer Solutions. So she says, China is big, Norway is small. In my mind, this by definition means non-equal collaboration, if any. The EU has good intentions, but it's too diverse. It takes too long to align everyone and to make decisions that lead to competitive position in commercial terms. What about Nordics collaboration? What are your thoughts on competitive potential on collaboration in the Nordics?
Really good question. Okay, let's start with that part of the Nordics part here. I mean, there is Nordic Council. There's been a strong Nordic cooperation. But I think what we're seeing probably across the board is that given Norway is not a member of the European Union, again, I'm not going to start a debate here about that, but it's displaced in terms of that. And obviously Sweden, Denmark sometimes does its favors, and Norway will do its favors, and then has NATO, and they have like joint issues that we have with the UK that is more military based, including Poland and other countries. So I mean, there's a multitude of these things here. I think what Norway's quite good is quite playing those. So you're playing those different levels here, and its role in the United Nations as well. So that's an important to manage that one. Just again, that you're a small country, yes, but also an important one in terms of actually energy for Europe. I mean, Norway completely is an essential part of the energy mix for Europe. But we have to still remember that, and I heard this from Dan Jurgensen, who's the European Commissioner for Energy, 1.8 billion euros is spent per month on Russian gas in Norway. We're still importing a bucket load of LNG, liquefied natural gas.
Not in Norway, sir, in Europe.
No, in Europe, and we, so there's a few key countries that do that. France, Germany, some are there. But this is still a major problem, and that is an issue. That's more money than we're giving to Ukraine to try and help protect itself. So, playing on these different levels is going to be important. On the China bit as well is, and I know the political tensions. There's a major EU summit in Beijing in July. Let's see how that turns out there. But you can't avoid China. It's just so big in terms of the energy space. And given the politics and there we are in different cohesions between a realigned US, the way Asia's running and the way that the Middle East is, India here, I mean, you have to really understand that there is a diplomatic aspect here. And that's where Norway plays strong. Norway plays very strong in terms of diplomacy, that soft power in the background there. And I think it does, that's where small countries can make a difference.
There was an interesting perspective that I think is relevant to the question offered in a previous episode that we did with Yves Dacour. Yves is the former Secretary General of the ICRC, the Red Cross. And he was comparing China, the US, and Europe. And he actually thought that Europe's relative disorganization or decentralized power structure was a strength now that we've seen what's happened in the US unfold. And 2 or 3 years ago, with the IRA in full force, we would have said, wow, the US is going places, and it's sort of US and China. But now with the IRA being pulled back a little bit in an interesting political situation that we're not going to comment on here, that's changed. And maybe the fact that Europe is as decentralized as it is a strength. That's also an interesting thing to think of. That doesn't mean that it wouldn't take considerable energy to mobilize the type of collaboration that Irina's talking about. But it might be a more interesting and hopeful place to try it than in North America at the moment. Go ahead.
Eric,
So yeah, you started out on the Petrostate discussion on looking at the growth of the industry, and since you're coming from UK, drawing on that experience, it's like you saw on the UK continental shelf there was 15 years of drop of oil and gas production from just before 2000. Norwegian oil production, it had a peak just after 2000, but then it's been compensated by a strong growth in gas. And looking at Aberdeen, it's like you go there and you see it's just sort of fallen apart in some way. UK has been based on markets and it's not really sort of come up with a good plan. And now all the politicians are trying to find something to do. Should Stavanger be afraid of having the same development?
Well, Stavanger stands on lots of different other elements around there. You know, one that is not just oil and gas in Stavanger, as we know. So there's industry, there's agriculture, there's tourism, fantastic food festival. So there's a lot going on in that respect. But you know, the decline you saw in Aberdeen, you know, been traveled to Aberdeen every year for 25 years, is, you know, it happened very quickly. It really did. And then hopefully we can help build that up with offshore wind, particularly our Greenvolt project from Vågden. So that is a concern, definitely. But there's the importance of actually having different legs to stand on. And, you know, you do have some major yards along there, and we have some things that are basically subsea oriented and some that are very sort of larger topside platform oriented yards that they need to actually be repositioned. Whether that is military and defense with larger NATO contracts, or is that going to be different types of business parks, or is it going to be that you could actually bring in data centers in some of those areas? I mean, there's an ideal repurposing for some of the yards that you have in bigger industry in the area. I think that's super important. But, you know, Eric, you know a lot about this. So what's your reflections?
No, I think it was quite interesting when Norway had the climate committee, so looking at Norwegian policies and what's required to meet the climate targets, then was proposed to make a plan for the reduction of oil and gas production. And it was sort of just thrown out from politics. They said it's like, no, we can't go that way. While actually that thinking about we need to plan is something that I see necessary, because we don't want to go down the route of Aberdeen, seeing a rapid decline with no actions taken at an early stage. So rather than seeing it as a plan for closing something down, we could build a plan for the next phase, the next energy phase, the next opportunities.
Yeah. I think it's a very lot of reflection in the room. I really appreciate it here at Conduit. That's fantastic. And I really appreciate your view both on the historic side and what to be doing in the future. I'm thinking on the historic side, it's interesting looking at the assets or how we handle the assets of the oil and the decisions made. Though we have to remember a thing, I don't know if you mentioned it, but Norway was never an innovation place. Mm. You have to realize it's always came after everyone else. We were lucky to find it, and we built it based on other people's technology. We just controlled it in a sense. And the creation of thinking that Norway now should turn into becoming this huge innovation hub to create a new world, I think is unrealistic. Even with the electrification, everything was existing. We were just lucky having the nature. You know, the oil, everything was existing. You just had the people to come and we control it. So the question was, what we do look at now, it's the minerals. Obviously, you said China obviously have, and we have found some difference in Norway. What do we do about that? And because we need storage, and we think batteries is a solution for it. I don't think batteries is a solution, because we're just creating a new environmental problem. We need to find other solutions. So the question will be, what do you think about the exploration of these new minerals and the types of that, and where should we place ourselves in the evolution of the new things in Norway? I believe there is a restriction around this, thinking, let's be the good followers. And that's our historic position, not the lead. I'm just asking how you think about that.
The oil and gas sector in Norway is incredibly innovative. And I think subsea compression, Åsgard, it was basically, huge, Thinking, but this is a general issue across the industry. The oil and gas industry, high return, high reward, part of it. A lot of risk related to it, but it always needs to keep developing technology to move the boundaries to get more oil and gas out there in more difficult places. And these are private companies. And if you look at their R&D budget, they compare that to a utility for the electricity sector. Most of them are state-owned in the electricity sector, and they're regulated, and they don't spend hardly any money in R&D. So, there's not a huge innovative sector itself. You have obviously some companies, Siemens, GE, etc., that do. But the Chinese do. They add a lot of innovation in terms of actually technology for electrons. But I think there are some spots there.
Creative, and they're not innovative, the Chinese.
Oh, no, I think they are.
They are now.
Yeah, no.
So I'm attacking your point about saying that Norway is potentially not creative and not innovative, because 5-10 years ago, we would have been saying the same about China, and look at the tracks that they're making. So I think it's like, we should be careful what we declare defeat on, because they have been an amazing story of just surprising everybody in 20 places at the same time, which is pretty interesting, right? I think that's a cool thing to learn from, because then you have to ask yourself, my gosh, with the resources that we have available here, are we seriously going to say that we couldn't? But then also, Stephen just said, well, in the oil and gas sector, as you say, maybe we didn't start it, but we came into it 1/3 or 2/3 of the way through it, and then we're dramatically innovative and completely changing the space, right, with the subsea work that Norway did. Sorry.
So innovation, it's the definition of innovation. It's what you're describing, it's improvement. Innovation, doing something brand new out of nothing. That's innovation. And I agree, it's very distinct, there's differences in the scale of this. And of course, there has been innovation as well. You're doing extracting oil in a very different way than we did before. It's still under the area of one sector paid system. It's this industry already existing. That's my point. I'm saying we are not good at starting something brand new from nothing. And we are trying to do that. We're trying to do this with the wind sector. It's still unsure, We're trying to do it within the battery sector. We're not good at these things. I'm sorry. I'm just like observing these type of things.
Why not? Because you have a welfare state here. This is not the US. If you go, sort of completely out in the US, or you're, Chapter 11, whatever, you don't have a massive welfare state to pull back on. Why can't we have more innovation in Norway, more risk-taking? Because you do have a welfare state to actually protect people who need to pick themselves back up again and try another time or try another job.
I think in Sweden, they're very good at actually trying things, startups, young people getting into it. Almost everybody has their own company, almost. Just like it. It's some in Germany, it's some in the Netherlands. I am from the Netherlands originally. But we have that very limited in Norway. And with everything that's happening in the Norwegian government taxing startups, founders, and all of that, it's not helping.
No.
And your point of how can we stimulate other industries in Norway, and I've been living here now for 4 years, looking on the outside into Norway and the societies, that you have had such a comfortable pillow around you with the oil and gas fund. I think it has reduced people's eagerness, incentivized to actually do things. So I think there is something to be said about that.
Should we do one final question on China? Great discussion inside Stephen and Rick. Thanks. This is from Nanad, by the way, from Hydro Rein. China dominates onshore wind, but its offshore and floating wind sectors are accelerating. Yang's typhoon-resistant floating turbines and projections for about 5 megawatts of floating capacity by 2026 suggest they can lead this niche too. How does their technology compare to Western equivalents, and what geopolitical risks arise if China controls offshore wind supply chains?
That sounds like a question that was made for Stephen Bull.
I can't believe it. No, it's an extremely important question, and in some respects, a little bit of an existential one for the European offshore wind industry. So currently, let me unpack it there. There's 3 big European Western, let's call them Western-based offshore wind OEMs, we call them, original equipment manufacturers. You got GE Vernova, you got Vestas, and you got Siemens Gamesa. So they're the 3 that kind of dominate it. If you take a big look at the total world, then you'll just see that China is already the largest offshore wind market in the world. UK is number 2, but China's like way out there. China's focused, as always, on its domestic market, build that up, perfect it, get the quality, and then start exporting, just like it's done with cars. So that's essentially where they are now. There's a crossroads of where Chinese wind turbines they already are entered. They're in a market. They're in Italy already. There is a demo project with Mingyang. There are actually some onshore wind turbines in other countries in Europe already. So we're in a phase here. Is that going to destroy the European industry, or is that something we could cooperate? Where you have, for example, with the German, the car sector, the auto sector has to work with China. One thing's to sell vehicles out there, but also to take the battery technologies, which is so advanced today. So I think that, again, it's hopefully it's not either or, it's both and when it comes to Chinese and Western countries, particularly in wind, where they really do dominate the total space.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks to everybody online as well. for joining us and taking some time out of a beautiful Friday afternoon.
You've been listening to What the Fuck Now, hosted by Rick Wheatley and produced by the S7 team. We love that you've listened, but we'd love even more to hear what you think. If you've got feedback or ideas for guests or topics we should tackle, we're all ears. Thanks for tuning in, and see you next time.